you for tuning in, and thank you for your patience as we waited a couple minutes for the bandwidth to finalize processing the deck. I'm Chris Snook. It's a pleasure to have you here this Wednesday. I hope you're staying healthy. We're going to talk about a serious subject in the next couple of minutes and keep it relatively brief, but focus in on several of the resources and the other side of the narrative so that you can not only help yourselves at home, but also be a leader inside of your organizations and be a source of help and support for those who may need it in your proximity. So thanks again to our sponsors at Emerged for making these weekly webinars, available to everyone. And so we'll start out by just thanking them. If you'd like more information on their business to prospect relationship management services and their AI-driven platform, you can check it out at emerge.com. You can also get in touch with Cameron over there, whose email will be in the resources, and mention Decisions 2020, and you'll get some free value out of them as they assess whether there's mutual fit. So without further ado, my name's Chris Snook. I am an author. I'm a thought leader. I'm a 20-year entrepreneur, early stage investor, and executive. I am not a licensed mental health professional. So I say that as a disclaimer. I normally don't have to put in, but as we go through this and you throw questions in the chat, or if you want to submit Q&A and participate in the live calls, I am not a licensed mental health care professional. I have several resources in here that you can connect to and that are, but I am a human being, and I am someone who cares deeply about the organizations that I work with and the people around me, as I'm sure you do as well. And so I feel very called to share some of the insights from today and some of the resources for today, as well as connect you with the proper mental health professionals or organizations where those in your circle could get proper care or help if that is needed. So please make sure you do that in the proper way if that's relevant to anyone in your circle or in your proximity. So let's talk about how we'll go through today's webinar. Again, we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID-19, the fallout that I think is a probabilistic fallout and already starting to show up, but will most likely show up months, if not a year or so after we get our hands around this. And as always, part of the methodology here is to provide you frameworks. In this case, it's support and resources and hotlines, and then document that and give you guys a good send-off for your Wednesday. So update as of today, I checked right before the webinar. I'm not sure the status of Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the UK, but I think the point of this slide is to talk about a lot of the impacts. You know, we're seeing WHO and CDC and several other government officials in the United States talk about how this week is going to be the peak, or how we're already seeing data that is trending down. And I hope that's true. Whether that's true or not, I think the risk of being a human is that we oftentimes look for the release valve when it may or may not be there. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no one on this webinar, certainly I am not someone who wants to have this be perpetuated any longer than it needs to be. But I'm also a realist and a pragmatist, and I think many of you are. And you just can't have something of this magnitude not have follow-on or knock-on effects that are felt for months or years. So even if that is true, and even if we nip this in the bud tomorrow, which is not likely and certainly not probable, but even if that was the case, there would still be several of the follow-on, both economic, mental, and societal effects that we're going to be speaking of today. So I think better for us to continue to be vigilant, to continue to take this more serious than ever before, and watch the data, but also watch our gut and watch our pragmatic sense of gut level knowledge that tells us that there's a lot to unpack even when this is all said and done. And in the interim, we need to be able to find the resources to proactively address these issues in advance. So, you know, we've talked about the PPP last Friday. You know, part of the $2 trillion stimulus was to authorize $350 billion worth of small business lending. through the Paycheck Protection Program. This was going to be guaranteed funding. This was going to be immediate. It is moving through the system actually rather quickly. I know of several organizations in the portfolio that were able to finally process their application yesterday after being in queue on Friday. So I'm assuming they'll, see their results and whether they were approved for that level of funding and paycheck protections or not within the next couple of days. But neither here nor there, Wells Fargo, literally on the 5th, which was 2 days after it went live, had already capped out and already had basically said, we're done. There's talk that another $250 billion or another $350 billion potentially, I can't remember which the number is, by Treasury Secretary would be approved to add to the existing 350 because it was already oversubscribed. Whether that happens or not, there's been several things out in the Twitterverse and out in the media that have already showed that it's not necessarily working as planned. I ultimately am of the hope and of the belief that they will be able to deliver on the promises they made to folks, because obviously it's critical. But just the very nary of doubt that this is another government program that may or may not work as planned, along with the stimulus checks that are supposed to go out as of this week. These are very volatile times. These are very pacifying and important methodologies that if they fumble, you're dealing with a tinderbox of emotion across not only this country, but in other parts of the world that are doing similar programs, and failure can cause a lot of ripple effects. And so these are the things that people have in their mind. Whether everything works out or not, you and your teammates working virtually, working from home, are dealing with this with their spouses, with their significant others, with their children, with their parents. And so, these things are out there in the universe. A world leader is in ICU. Hopefully he'll recover. The Javits Center in New York, for those of you who know that, have been turned completely into a hospital. And yet in Florida, as of a week ago, people were still acting like this on the beach, according to one news story, and not distancing. And so I think the reality of this is just a microcosm of human behavior, which is that when it hits home hard. And when it isn't in your backyard and you're in a little bubble around it, it's just so easy to be compliant, but only to a degree, and to pretend like it's not going to happen to us. And so these are just things that are important to understand. The state of confusion is probably at all-time highs. There's irrational market factors happening. Hi, Adriel. Nice to see you. Thank you for the nice note in chat. Hope you're well as well. Guys, feel free to give me a diversion and let me know you're here and you're able to hear me well. Some of you are old friends that I haven't seen in a while. I miss you. So I hope all is well. And back to this. So the irrational markets, denial that they're acting irrationally. When you have S&P and volatility indexes acting like the crypto markets they so love to loathe, it's kind of ironic. Rising BKs haven't even begun. The amount of unemployment checks that will be needed, and the amount of unemployment requests that'll be filed, is on the low end of the bell curve, not the peak of the bell curve. And the associated bankruptcies between everything from dental offices to restaurants and small businesses has not had a chance to even begin to be filed, let alone work its way through the system. And all these things lead to falling hope for several people. Recurring cases of the illness have started to appear. Anecdotally, I'm not sure, and please don't quote me because I don't want to misinformation anybody. But I have heard that there have been some recurring cases that they're trying to figure out the scientific basis on, related in China and other markets that have already kind of gone through a first wave. History tells us through the Spanish flu and through other pandemics that a recurrence of multiple waves of this coming back will be there. The idea with the whole flattening of the curve, for many of you that you already realize that, is that we can make sure that the capacity is there to treat these things. Back to New York, they have not begun to do this yet, but they have been preparing for it. And this is just how real this can be. When you're digging a trench in Central Park for mass burials in the event that you run out of space in Brooklyn or in other places, this is not something to be taken lightly, and this is not something to exhale on just yet. even though 4 weeks into quarantine for many of you, you're probably ready to go back to what you think was normal. That may or may not be possible. And even if it is possible, we need to walk before we run. Cabin fever and defiance, obviously, we just spoke about that. And all this leads to these things like risk of inpatient and anxiety. And what I believe, unfortunately, and I'm not an expert in it, but I've been reading about it voraciously the last several days, is a potential pandemic of PTSD at a global scale. We've never actually had to face that before as humanitarians and as human beings. And so regardless of what happens and regardless of whether the jury is in or out on the government actions and how successful they will or won't be, there will be a follow-on effect of mental health disease at a proportion that we've never seen. So as always, in the polls, I'm going to fire these up while we keep talking. You can answer them just to give us some feedback and understand kind of where this audience is. Are you currently sheltering in place except for essentials? Most of you know what that means by now. Are you actively getting physical exercise at least 30 minutes per day since the quarantine began? Or are you consuming more alcohol than usual since the quarantine began? These are anonymous questions that we're not going to publish this poll anywhere. Helps us understand by percentage maybe what's top of mind for you as we finish off the rest of this dialogue. And so just take a second. Yes by mandate, yes voluntarily, or no are the options for the first poll. I'm going to publish that one now so that you can weigh in on that. And we'll give that a couple seconds. And then we'll go to the next two, and then we'll move on. Feel free to tell me where you're dialing in from or listening in from today. I see we have Texas, California, some Arizona, a little bit of New York. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Several of you, it looks like the majority of you are yes by mandate, so you're in states that have mandated it. Do we have anybody listening in from one of the states that has not mandated it, but where they've suggested it? If so, just let us know. Just curious where the organic reach for these invitations has been. All right, so I'm going to end this poll, and we'll bring up the next two just really quickly. These will be fast. All right, and are you actively getting? So here's the fitness one. Again, no one's going to report you. This is more for your own self-awareness. 5 days per week, yes. 2 to 4 days per week. 30 minutes would be, 20 to 60 minutes would be obviously the recommended under normal circumstances. This is really more of our days have been completely flipped upside down. Many of us have realized that when you factor out commutes and meetings and things like that that don't require travel time, all of a sudden you get 3 to 4 hours of your day back. And what do you do with it? Especially when you're sitting at home and you've got significant other spouses, children that want and need your attention and are also dealing with the shift. The first couple of weeks is kind of, if it's anything like my household, the first couple of weeks is kind of weird and you almost don't, know what to do at the time, and you end up falling into a myriad of things. And sometimes the day feels a little bit unstructured. Then you get into some kind of new cadence around it. So I'm just curious how many of you have added back in exercise, fallen away from it. I'm going to end that one. And then everyone's favorite, and this is not to make light of those who I have been in touch with several people through Twitter and things like that have managed and have done miraculous things with virtual support groups to not fall into these old habits. But if you are a moderate drinker or someone who has not faced addiction at this point or has not admitted to that, just again, level set. Are you drinking the same? Are you drinking a little bit more? Do you need to go see Betty Ford after this whole thing? Or have you been able to consciously quit it, either just because of discipline or remain sober if you are in recovery? Just, again, a little bit of self-awareness, a little bit of group awareness for us to understand which of these resources moving forward may be most important to you or your organization. So we'll let you take a couple more seconds to answer that poll. I'll leave that up and I'll move forward with the slides. So let's talk about feeling fear but not living in it. As we always do with the etymology, it's interesting. Fear comes from the Middle English word fear, which stood for calamity, sudden danger, peril, sudden attack. All of those things have kind of been how COVID came on the scene, right? It felt sudden. It's a calamity. it has peril, and certainly it puts us all in sudden danger. Fear too, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, is the Middle English version of the word that applies to a state of being afraid and living with uneasiness. And I bring this up because sometimes we think these things are one and the same, and in many cases maybe they are, but a lot of times the feeling of fear, this sudden danger, this recognition of peril, sudden attack, can move into outside of our awareness, unconsciously, into us living in a state of fear or a state of uneasiness. And I had a conversation with someone I care deeply about recently this past week that said that they don't want to live in fear, and it was almost it was an interesting way that the tonality of it was said, because it was kind of like I'm not going to live in fear, and yet the way that it was said indicated to me that they might already be there. And in as loving and assertive a way as I possibly could, I tried to reframe it for them and say, are you afraid that you're living in fear, that you're going to live in fear? Because it sounds like you kind of are operating from that standpoint, but denying that you are. And the reality is that not feeling fear isn't a human ability. We don't have the ability to not feel fear, but we do have the choice and the ability, although it's difficult sometimes, to not live in the state of fear. And we had a good conversation around it and differentiated some things. And the notion that admitting one is fearful at any given moment is not a sign of weakness. And it is just literally a sign of recognition that right there in that moment, we are experiencing things that are taking us over and taking us down a thought pattern that is destructive, and that is and that is kind of consuming. And so being able to share when we are in that place, whether it's with a loved one, with a friend, or better yet, with someone who can actually help us work through it if it's really severe, is a key thing. And I think as an organizational leader, it's important that we allow for the space for people to be safe, in knowing that, just because they feel fear around certain things doesn't mean that that they're going to be stigmatized by us. Again, not by the whole organization, but by you as the individual, for being human. So fear is a human response. It's number one. Well-being requires more effort than ever, more social interaction than ever during times like this. So again, back to the questions. Have you worked out lately? Have you logged off and taken some mental time, regardless of whether that's through meditation or whatever? Not everybody's a meditator. But are you doing things to get off of a screen, to get out of a book, to get into your own head for 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, to breathe, to jump in cold water, to do whatever these things that we know are proven, or alternative forms of getting centered? And what new social contracts will we need post COVID-19? And I think a lot of that has to do with starting with the recognition of where the world is likely to be. So here's some of the myths, because we're going to talk about PTSD. And I think it's important because I didn't understand some of these things as well. And post-traumatic stress disorder is in the name, right? And this is a traumatic event at a global scale, unprecedented. There's never been something that's impacted all 7.8 billion people on the planet at one time, in a world where we are hyper-connected, and have access to everyone and everything, and misinformation and true information all at the same time. And so this is a truly unprecedented crisis. Regardless of how serious you think the virus is or is not, regardless of whether you're wearing a tin hat conspiracy theorist or whether you are the most, science-driven, facts-driven analyst on the front line of the medical community, this thing is real in the way that it has impacted all 7.8 billion people on the planet and every country on the planet. So myth number one about post-traumatic stress is that it affects you immediately after. Immediately being a period of 90 days. This is a myth that's out there, and the research shows that it sometimes can take years for symptoms to appear. In relationships where there was prior abuse or ongoing abuse, a new trauma such as COVID-19 could take years to appear, because there's a certain level of acceptance of the already toxic environment that person may or may not be living in, that doesn't allow them to even go there and realize that there's this new stimulus and this new trauma. And so, again, it is not something that 90 days after you're out of the fire, so to speak, related to COVID-19, whether that's losing a loved one, having a close call with a loved one or with yourself or your own family, or just being afraid of it all and being locked in your sardine can in New York City for 6 weeks and needing a break. 90 days after is a good metric to kind of monitor, but it does not mean you're out of the woods. And so you want to get familiar with what the symptoms are and just monitor yourself. Myth number 2 is that only military vets experience it. I don't know that I believe that, but I think that most of the cases that we've heard of and most of the movies that have been made about PTSD talk about, Iraq war vets or Vietnam war vets or anything of the nature. And so obviously this infects the military community at large, and that's well documented, but this can develop in anyone. And research says that women are twice as likely. So actually 10% of all women in existence, if faced with a trauma, will actually get PTSD in some shape or form. 10% of all women, according to research. 20% of those who experience a traumatic event, which in the US, they say that 70% of our population in their lifetime will experience a traumatic event. Well, I think that just went out the window because we've all experienced a traumatic event, whether we want to admit it or not. But let's just stick with that number. Out of the 70% of us that will experience a traumatic event in life, 20% of us will end up with PTSD. I mean, that's pretty startling in a second here when we look at the last quadrant. Myth number 3 is that PTSD is a sign of mental weakness and people should just get over it. This is us just not having an awareness. I may, and not proud of this at all, there may be times where in my life I felt like people that had alcoholism or other afflictions should just not drink or not get over it. That was my lack of understanding. That was my ignorance and not knowing what I didn't know of the disease nature of it. Now, mental weakness will make you more vulnerable to anything. However, PTSD has been proven that this is not a matter of whether someone is mentally weak or mentally strong. Very important for people who have had a history of being mentally strong, which is typically your leaders inside of companies, typically your executives. They didn't get there by accident. So this mental strength, this mental fortitude, this resilience that you've cultivated as an entrepreneur, as an executive, or as a money manager. These things are strengths, but they can be liabilities if you think that PTSD can't get you, because you may ignore the symptoms, you may ignore the signs, you may feel the stigma around it because you're afraid to look weak, or your persona and your position has you feeling that, and therefore you don't seek treatment. And I think that's the whole point, is that if there's ever been a time where human beings can be more human to each other, including starting with ourselves, it's now. It's now. So I encourage you to put the stigmas aside in your own mind first, have empathy for others, and just watch this and do what you can to prevent it or proactively treat it. Simple math, and why I think that the pandemic, beyond the pandemic, is something that we need to be talking about now. We need to get the mental health community and CDC talking about as well, even though they got plenty on their plate, is that if you have 7.8 billion people in the world, and let's say that 70% isn't the number globally, let's say it's 50% of people that experience trauma will end up with PTSD as a risk factor. Well, then that takes that down to 3.4 billion people will have a chance at manifesting PTSD in some way, shape, or form on the backside of this or during this crisis. Well, if 20% of them get it, that's 780 million new cases of PTSD. And I said by the next 5 years, because I honestly think this window is going to be 18 months to 20 months before it's all figured out, before we have a sense of whether or not the vaccines are working or whether they need to be iterated each year. And again, the immediate trauma may be over in a couple of months. It may return, but we'll be somewhat used to it, so it may be less impactful in the future waves. But I do think there's a sincere probable chance that almost 750 million people on the earth end up with post-traumatic stress disorder. And that means that you're likely to know someone in your organization or in your family that is getting it because of this specific thing. So what can you do? Wrapping up, a couple of places to go, and these are all in the resources. I'll fly through these because you can learn about these if they're relevant to you. But as a cheat sheet, this is a 24/7 hotline. I've actually called the number and verified that it worked. They actually will talk with men too. I know it says women in abusive situations, but I specifically asked that, is this available for men as well? And do men call? And roughly 10% of the people that call this number are men. And it's actually something they wish they saw more of. Obviously, most of the time, men are not the victim, they're the perpetrator, sadly. However, there are times where men are the victim and the female is the perpetrator. And so, again, even though that's a smaller percentage, this is a gender neutral, relationship neutral number. You can call it. If you're not sure if you're a victim of verbal or some other kind of abuse, call it and ask. It's totally anonymous. You can chat with them if you don't want to have a verbal conversation. So very valuable resource 24/7 for those who may need it. Apps that are available through the VA that are free online and that have been downloaded and heavily reviewed. So I'm assuming that they're good. Are the PTSD coach and the PTSD family coach. Both of these are provided by the VA, but available to anybody, whether they're military or not. So you can go to these links and you can check out these different resources for not only information about PTSD, how to recognize and look at symptoms, but also facts about counseling and how to work with couples that may be managing it if one or both people have it, and then also find support networks. The mindfulness coach is more of a preventative, proactive app, and also kind of an ongoing practice to help you center yourself when flare-ups occur. So all three of these come out of the VA. The links are there. They'll also be in the resources on the deck, and the deck has been shared on LinkedIn publicly, so you can download it there. Lastly, the last two would be for more general Anxiety and Depression Association America. They've got some resources out, as you would imagine, related specifically to managing COVID-19 anxiety. Again, take what you want, leave the rest, but these are just a variety of resources so that you don't have just one to look at. I know you can Google this stuff, but sometimes we just don't think to, and it's nice to have it in one place. So that's why this week's webinar, we chose to kind of not talk about how to move your business forward, because I think just gut level that right now people are still trying to manage and understand, where they are in this limbo period. And so we felt this might be a little bit more relevant content for the given week and the given time. And for those who, there's several of these, I'm sure. This was one that I found that seemed to have a lot of online meetings. Looks like it is geographically agnostic. You could probably Google AA online meeting near me and find whatever you needed much faster. But if you're looking for a starting point and you just want to remove the friction, I would start here for those who are looking to maybe take control of their drinking or things like that. Something I've personally done, you guys have probably done something similar to this. I had been familiar with all these things. I actually came up in the fitness industry, but like everybody, even though staying healthy has been something in my life for the last 25, 30 years, as far as physical fitness goes, I hadn't worked out probably in 7-8 months for any number of reasons. And fortunately, my body's, used to it enough where I can get away with it. Most people wouldn't know that if they looked at me, but I knew it internally. And, having a gym membership, things like that prior to COVID-19 just became kind of a pain. I kind of need classes. I want I don't want to have to think about one more thing. So all these different excuses and about a week into the quarantine, I'm just sitting there and watching more Netflix and studying more, crypto and investment stuff than I can think of. And my mental fitness is going through the roof. And I'm realizing that I just need to get the endorphins going. I have to do something. And thankfully Peloton has an app which doesn't require the bike, doesn't require any equipment, doesn't require, the bigger investment into the treadmills or things like that. Those are available too. But I, unsolicited, I am a customer. I'm a happy customer. Been doing it for 2-3 weeks, and they've got phenomenal choices of body weight, yoga, strength classes, things like that. And it's a good way to kick my butt 20 to 45 minutes a day. And so, I'm on the wagon again, as they say. Just so you know that I'm not biased one way or the other than my personal experience. Daily Burn is another well-known one that has a ton of content in it. Looks like they're doing a 30-day trial. Gaiam is another one that I've had friends talk about. I didn't put them on here, but again, pick something. I actually believe that these businesses when you start to look at some of these things in a post-COVID-19 world, become a beneficiary of it, because I think that certain aspects of our day we're going to claim back, and we're going to do more efficiently, and we're going to find out that, especially for business travelers, something like this solves a lot of problems. You can take it into the hotel room, or you can take it into the hotel gym, but you don't have to come up with something on the fly. And so for $13 a month, it's pretty hard to argue with something like this, just as a utility when we're paying similar for access to Netflix and other things. So I think some of these businesses are going to not only boom in the interim from a user base, but conversion wise would be interesting to watch. And it gets you thinking about what other industries like online education might also take over when 1.4 billion students who have been forced to be homeschooled have the optionality now to go back or to find a way to continue to do this in a virtual environment. I think there's going to be some real interesting innovation that happens on the positive side of all this. So in summary, the impacts in the fall haven't even begun. I think it's delusional and human to think that they are, because we all want it over. But the reality is that it's not going to be over anytime soon, and the knock-on effects will take some time to work themselves through. I think managing your mental and physical health early is going to be the key to success, both personally but also inside of your company. And so, please, there's no shame in being human. Ask for help. Stay healthy. I do believe we're not only going to be okay, that we're going to be better, but we're going to be going through some real big stuff. And society's, the people that aren't listening to this are the ones who need it the most, and that's the majority of people in your workforce or in your neighbor, in your city, that may or may not have the awareness or the tools or the access, or maybe living in situations that were already toxic and now are being forced to be contained in those situations. And so my heart goes out to those people, and every little bit that any of us can do to help them, I think we should. Here's the list of resources. Again, thank you to Emerged for making these available for everybody, and for engaging me to do it. And I'm happy to answer any questions via email or direct you to any of these sources, but they're pretty self-directed. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you on next week's webinar. We'll post the topic up shortly. And it's been a great one. Thank you guys for tuning in.